Please welcome the CEO of Airdna, Demi Horvat, and Senior Vice President of Analytics and Chief Economist of Airdna, Jamie Lane.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, especially after lunch. We hope you enjoyed it. And please forgive the cruelty of the Skift team in scheduling a data presentation for right after lunch when you're already sleepy. We'll try to keep it exciting, keep the energy up. And we also would ask that if you're in the app and you have questions, please do submit them while we're speaking, because we're hoping to reserve some time at the end to cover those. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start off just by sharing a little bit of context about our data. I've heard Jamie on a couple of podcasts say that you should not believe an insight that someone is telling you unless you understand the underlying data that it's based off of. So our intention is to do that for you today. So I wanted to walk you through first just what you're going to see when we talk about our data, and then secondly, how that data set actually comes together in terms of our data sources. So the Airdna data set covers 120,000 international markets across the world. We have data on 12 million plus daily listings, almost 30 million unique properties, 6 trillion total data points collected, a number that I cannot even fathom. And we've been doing this for over 8 years. So that's a long history of building this data set over many, many years. And the way that our data set actually comes together and is built is that we have 3 different data sources. And I believe that having those 3 data sources contributes to our position as far as having the breadth, depth, and accuracy at an intersection of those 3 things that really sets us apart. And the way that those data sources kind of come together is that we have over 30 million properties that we're scraping. Those are properties on Airbnb and Vrbo and cover every property globally, whether it's professionally managed or not professionally managed, to the point of one of the earlier speakers about how much of the market is actually not professionally managed properties, and we're able to provide insight on those. Secondly, we bring in partner data. So that's over 1 million properties that we bring in through our data partners, and that gives us additional coverage over many of those professionally managed properties, also a very high degree of data accuracy. And then lastly, and interestingly, in this part of the market, we also have user-contributed data. So we have our MarketMinder software platform where we're helping people figure out what market they might want to invest in, buy a property, help them price that property. And that software platform is also a data producer for our data set. So we have over 80,000 properties that we have user-contributed data for that we pull into that cohesive data set that undergirds all of the products that we offer all of you. So that's the context on our data. Just to share a little bit about where we're headed, we were acquired by a private equity firm called Alpine Investors last year in February of 2022. And that has been an awesome experience in that we've been investing very heavily behind continuing to improve our data set, bring more data into our ecosystem, and secondly, to really invest behind the products that sit on top of that data to make that data as usable as possible and accessible for all of the things that you need it for. So our vision is really for Airdna data to be powering every meaningful decision in the short-term rental space. And we're continuing along that path by making those investments in our data and on the products that give you the insights, some of which Jamie will walk through now. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Demi. And so we're going to get started, and we're going to talk about supply, demand, occupancy, ADRs, sort of what's going on in the housing market, the economy, and provide forecasts for where we see the industry going for all of those metrics. But I want to start with supply. And I'm going to send to the audience, who thinks we have too much supply in the short-term rental industry? Raise your hand. 2 people. So the industry is at an interesting point in that it was growing 20% per year leading up to the start of the pandemic. We then saw a pretty significant decline in supply, and you can see that in blue on the chart. we're well below pre-pandemic trend in terms of growth. So over the past year, we've seen about 19% more listings, and that's actually decreasing in terms of the growth rates. I just got May data as of this morning, and growth rate was only 15%. So as summer of last year, we were growing 25%. We're seeing that growth rate slow substantially. We're only now 28% higher in terms of supply relative to at the same time in 2019. So you think growing 20% a year, now 3 years later, only 28% more supply than pre-pandemic. We've been in a period of really low supply growth, even with the sort of increase that we've seen over the past year. Half of the top 50 short-term rental markets around the US are still below 2019 levels of supply. So the supply growth has not been even. And the fastest growth is coming, I like to call it a barbell. It's coming from the smallest operators, those with just one unit, and those of the largest operators, those with 20 plus units, those with the large property managers. The slowest growth is sort of those mid-size operators that are maybe having a hard time scaling their business today. And we are seeing some really strong headwinds in terms of new growth, both from regulation and from the affordability of housing units. And we see that as gonna slow growth even further going forward. And during this presentation, so you're gonna hear me talk a lot about these 6 different location types. And we now have our forecast for these 6 different location types, and it breaks up the entire country into like geographic areas. So we start with large cities, so that's the largest 50 metro areas. And that's where we've seen the weakest growth, and urban areas are actually still below 2019 levels, even with our forecast for full year 2023. And we don't expect them to get above or at 2019 levels until 2024. Next is mountain and lake destination areas. So those are our traditional vacation rental markets and sort of defined areas throughout the country. Those saw really strong growth during the pandemic in both demand and now supply. But now we're seeing some of the weakest supply growth today, so about 10% growth year over year. There's some of the markets that are sort of pulling back in terms of revenue growth. They're seeing occupancy declines and had seen really strong increases in home values. And then the other ones on the right, so mid-sized cities, small city, rural areas, those have been some of the fastest growing. So mid-sized cities, their supply is 50% greater today than relative to 2019. And you can think of those as cities of between 100,000 and 1 million people. So like a Knoxville, a Birmingham, a really strong growth. And then everything else around the country gets lumped into small city rural. And that's where we've seen the most growth, 90% more listings. They've essentially doubled the amount of supply over the past 3 years. And that's still today where we're seeing the strongest growth, and still continues to surprise me on how fast growth is growing in those areas. Now let's switch over to demand. And demand is what has really been driving a lot of that supply growth. And we measure demand in 2 different ways. And this looks at weekly demand over the past 5 years. And this looks at demand as of the booking date. So as of last week, you see in this chart, how many nights were booked in the US across all US short-term rentals. And you see it's about 4.5 million nights booked in that last week. And we're seeing really strong booking momentum continue throughout the first half of 2023. We're still seeing it on 15-20% growth. We also track it relative to the stay date. And that's where we're still seeing strong growth. And that's where you get a lot more sort of typical seasonality in the charts. And we're sort of starting up on the sort of into peak season this summer. And there we're seeing growth anywhere from 12 to 15% over the past couple months. May came in strong again. But as you hear me say these numbers, demand is not growing as fast as supply. So supply growing 20%, demand only going 15%. And yes, that means occupancy is declining. And we've seen occupancy now decline for 15 consecutive months. And we see it across all location types. It's not just destination markets, it's also suburban and urban areas of these large major cities, given how much supply is now coming into a lot of those. So you see both historical, what's been happening, and then our forecast for what we expect to happen. And that's for another, let's say 17 months of declining occupancies. What you see though is during peak months in the summer, we're essentially getting back to 2019 levels. But where we're seeing occupancy still remain above 2019 levels is in sort of the shoulder and off seasons. So we're seeing an expanded seasonality for our industry, which in one ways is great because it means on a per unit basis, you're seeing overall higher occupancies, and we're not sort of focusing all the demand into one period, and lets us also raise rates during those shoulder seasons as well. One of the headwinds towards demand growth has been the lack of recovery of international travel. So you hear Airbnb talk about how cross-border travel is back. And cross-border travel is back. We're all going to Europe again. And this data comes from the US government. Outbound spend from US travelers is up 20% compared to pre-pandemic. We are traveling overseas. But the problem is that the US used to run a travel surplus. So we had more foreign travelers spending in the US than we Americans were spending outside. And that was about a $2 billion per month travel surplus. Today, that's a travel deficit. So we're not seeing international travel back. A big piece of that is because of the US dollar, how strong it is. It makes it really expensive for travelers to come to the US. It's making it really cheap to go to Europe. Europe's about on 20% discount. And that impacts different types of markets in different ways. So here you see the different location types broken out by their share of international travel. So urban areas, suburban areas, coastal destinations really did depend on international travel. So in urban areas, during summers, 28% of demand was coming from international guests. Now, if you were in small city rural areas, it was less than 10%. You don't really care. You're sort of picking up from elsewhere. But that's where you see a lot of these destinations in New York, Miami, Boston, Chicago are great examples. The fact that we don't have international travelers coming back yet has been a big reason why they've been slow to recover. That we do expect to change a bit. We're expecting exchange rates, the strength of the dollar to weaken a bit more, but that's going to be a headwind through at least 2024. And all the while, the share of short-term rental consumers from the US is now well above now 2019 levels. So Europeans are really seeing the benefit. That was a big benefit in 2022, where European demand essentially surpassed 2019 for the first time. So now we're getting to our forecasts. And these are new forecasts that we developed this year. And this latest version came out just last week, and we're announcing them for the first time today. So you guys are getting a sneak peek of a report that's going to come out later this week. And what we do is we take into account what's happening in the overall economy and translate that into what do we expect to see in the short-term rental industry. And we not just do our baseline scenario, and you see our baseline scenario does anticipate a recession. So who here actually thinks we're going to have a recession in 2023? Only a few hands. Who thinks we're already in a recession? A lot more people. Who thinks we're not going to have a recession in this year or next year? A good number of people. So in our baseline scenario, we're anticipating a recession, albeit a mild recession. But for all you guys that think we're not going to have a recession, you can look at the data from our upside scenario. So that anticipates a soft landing that we sort of get through this. Our downside scenario and severe downside scenarios anticipate a much deeper recession. The severe downside is essentially a 2008, 2009 type recession. So translating that then into industry performance, our baseline scenario anticipates about 10% demand growth over the next year. Upside, and there is a considerable chance of that upside, takes it up to 16% demand growth. That actually means we see occupancy growth over the next 18 months. Our downside scenario, though, anticipates only 6% demand growth. So even in a recession, we still expect more demand. And this sort of breaks out the forecast by the main metrics. So we're expecting about 14% supply growth over the next year. That slowed to 10% next year. We're expecting ADR growth to slow further So it has dropped by more than half. So we're growing rate 6% last year, only 2% in 2023. We expect that further to decline in 2024. And the important one, RevPAR. So we are expecting a decline in RevPAR, and that's the first time in the industry that we've been tracking data that we're expecting a decline in RevPAR. So not even in 2020 did we see a decline. So going back to when we started collecting data in 2014, we haven't seen a decline. So that will be the first time. And then by location type, and you start to get into the reasons why, the biggest declines are in mountain, coastal, suburban locations where we're seeing the most supply growth. This is a supply-driven decline in RevPAR, not necessarily driven by demand, which would typically cause a down cycle for the industry. On home values, that is a big reason why we're seeing that supply decline, rising interest rates, really strong home values, causing investors to have a pullback in investment. And this is also a new series, one that we created in the areas where there's short-term rentals, what are happening with home values, and specific to those zip codes. And this is where we're seeing now a pullback. And I think this is what a lot of you guys are expecting or hoping for, looking to invest in the industry, that home values are going to decrease even further. But now we're already seeing, as you can see, and we're seeing the plateauing to maybe an increase. So forecasts are that home values drop another 5%, but that is predicated on a weakening economic environment. So if we don't see a recession, I suspect we may have already seen the drop that we're going to see in home values. And then that sort of brings us to our forecast for industry revenue.
Awesome, thanks, Jamie. So I saw everyone taking their phones out for the big data slide. We'll keep this one high level. And it's funny because one of the speakers earlier today was talking about the question, are we at the trough of disappointment point or are we not? And I think our outlook about industry growth is quite positive. So we're actually forecasting that short-term rental revenue by the end of 2024 will reach almost $80 billion. So this is an industry that is growing. To Jamie's point and all of the data that he walked through, some of that growth might be variable in who's seeing it versus not. But broadly, we think this is a very positive picture. And we're excited to be kind of on that journey with all of you. We understand this is an industry that's had a lot of change, especially in the last few years, as so many have, what with COVID, changing macroeconomic conditions, interest rates, mortgage rates, inflation, and all of that has created uncertainty. And we want to be partners to everyone in the industry as you navigate a dynamic and changing environment. And we are strong believers in having informed decision making and with our data powering those decisions in the short-term rental market. So to Jamie's point, you're getting a sneak preview of the forecast. We would love to talk to you more about what's in that in our next networking break that's later this afternoon. So please stop by.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out. And we will take, we've got about 2 minutes left, so if you have any questions, there are some questions on here. So one of them is, where do you source your 80,000 individual hosts who report data points? So that is hosts that connect through our MarketMinder platform. So if you're a host, you're an investor, and you wanted to analyze your future performance versus your comp set, you've got to connect your sort of Airbnb account, your sort of platform, your bookings to our account. So we're collecting that directly from all those hosts. So we're feeding it back into you so you can see how you're performing, and then we can report to you how you're doing relative to your competition, showing how you're pricing on different nights so you can make sure you're optimizing on your rates and your performance going forward. Another one was, have you considered including hotel data?
Yeah, I can start off with that one. So related to what Jamie was saying about MarketMinder kind of being a source of data, bringing other data sets into our ecosystem is also something that we're excited to do. Over the last year, since our private equity investment, we've really been doubling down on the core vision for the business, which is in STR data. So we've put a ton of investment around continuing to make sure that that is a very robust data set at the highest quality, making sure that we are fulfilling the promise of those 3 data sets coming together with that overlap in the Venn diagram really being a source of advantage for us because we have the 3 kind of overlapping points to make sure that the rest of the data set is as accurate as possible. So definitely on the table, and we're broadly looking at additional data sets that we can bring in, and that will be driven by what's valuable for all of you, which is why we come to events like this and want to talk to you about it.
Yeah, interesting question. And will international consumers necessarily choose short-term rentals versus traditional lodging given brand loyalty? I think it goes into, and one, we see international travelers choose short-term rentals over traditional lodging more than domestic travelers. And broadly, that's because of trip length. If you're making the trip to the US, you're broadly staying for longer than 2 or 3 days. And the research that we've seen, when you're staying more than 3 or 4 days, your propensity to want to use a short-term rental goes up, and because of all the things that go along, all the additional amenities that go along with short-term rentals. So this is one where I'm really bullish around the industry long-term. As more and more cross-border travel happens, more and more travelers coming out of China, out of India, as more people come into the sort of global middle class, that is broadly going to be a main driver for short-term rental demand over the next 5 to 10 years.
I would just add to that, I think a couple of the other speakers today were talking about how people choose the accommodation that makes sense for their trip type. I think at the end of the day, it's all product market fit. If you're an international traveler coming on a red eye for a meeting for 3 hours, you might choose something different from if you're going to stay a while. So I think it's really that individual makes the choice based on their specific need, and it's a product market fit for each trip and what kind of accommodation they need. I think we're out of time.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.